3 years after burying him in her heart, Rose Halston saw her husband again, alive, wearing enemy colors and smiling like he never left. The sun beat down on Rose Halston's weathered face, each line a testament to 3 years of unrelenting grief and hard labor. Dust devils danced across the parched fields of her ranch, mocking her efforts to coax life from the stubborn land. Halston Ranch, once a symbol of hope and shared dreams with Caleb, now felt like a tomb. Caleb, the name was a dull ache in her heart, a constant reminder of the border skirmish that swallowed him whole. The army declared him missing, presumed dead. Rose refused to fully accept it, clinging to a sliver of hope that flickered like a dying ember. She ran a hand over the worn leather of his saddle, hanging untouched in the barn. The scent of him, of horses and wood smoke, still clung faintly to it, a phantom embrace. Memories flooded her. Caleb's booming laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the strength of his hand in hers. Rose's days were a relentless cycle of mending fences, tending to the cattle, and fighting off the encroaching despair. She was alone, save for the loyal ranch hand, old man Jebediah, who had been with the Halstons for decades. He offered quiet support, his presence a comforting anchor in the storm of her grief. He helped as best he could with the ranch, but his body was failing, and Rose found herself doing more and more of the work. Evenings were the hardest. The silence of the empty house amplified her loss. She'd sit on the porch, watching the sun bleed across the horizon, wondering where Caleb was, if he was even alive. Sometimes she'd swear she could hear his voice on the wind, a whisper of his name carried on the prairie breeze. Rose was no longer the woman Caleb had married. Grief had hardened her, etched a steely resolve onto her features. The soft, gentle Rose was buried alongside her husband's memory. In her place stood a woman forged in the fires of loss, a woman capable of anything to protect what little she had left. The ranch was more than just land. It was a testament to her love for Caleb, a promise she intended to keep, no matter the cost. But Rose's struggles weren't limited to the land and her memories. A simmering unrest had begun to boil over in the territory. Whispers of land disputes, broken treaties, and rising tensions between settlers and the native tribes filled the saloons and general stores. A militia, calling themselves the Border Guardians, had formed, promising to protect settlers from what they termed incursions and threats. Their presence was a constant source of unease. They rode through the towns, armed and intimidating, their rhetoric growing increasingly aggressive. They demanded loyalty, and those who didn't offer it freely found themselves facing subtle and sometimes not so subtle forms of harassment. The Halston Ranch, situated close to the disputed borderlands, was particularly vulnerable. Rose had always tried to maintain a neutral stance, offering help to anyone who needed it, regardless of their background. Caleb had believed in fairness and understanding, and she tried to uphold his values. But neutrality was becoming increasingly difficult, if not impossible. The Border Guardians had approached her several times, requesting donations and offering protection. Rose had politely refused, stating that she could handle her own affairs. This, of course, had not pleased them. Their leader, a man named Silas, with eyes as cold as a winter storm, had made it clear that her independence would not be tolerated indefinitely. Jebediah worried constantly. He'd seen this kind of thing before, the slow creep of hatred and violence, the way good people were forced to choose sides. He tried to convince Rose to leave, to sell the ranch and start over somewhere safe, but Rose refused. The Halston Ranch was her home, her legacy, and she wouldn't be driven out by fear. The tension was a palpable thing, hanging in the air like the threat of a storm. Rose knew that it was only a matter of time before something broke, before the simmering conflict erupted into open violence. And she feared that when that day came, she and her ranch would be caught in the crossfire. She just didn't know how right she was. The storm wasn't coming from outside, but from within her own heart. Rose needed supplies. Despite Jebediah's protests, she decided to ride into the nearby town of Redemption. It was a place she'd avoided lately, the atmosphere thick with suspicion and divided loyalties. But the ranch required provisions, and she was running low on everything from flour to ammunition. As she steered her horse down Redemption's main street, the tension was almost a physical weight. Men eyed her with suspicion, their hands hovering near their holsters. The usual bustle of the town seemed muted, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Rose quickly made her purchases, trying to keep her head down and avoid drawing attention. As she exited the general store, a group of border guardians rode into town, their horses kicking up dust. Silas was at the head, his cold gaze sweeping over the street, and then Rose saw him. Standing near the saloon, talking to one of the militiamen, was a man who looked exactly like Caleb. He was older, his face weathered and lined, but there was no mistaking the familiar set of his jaw, the way he stood with his weight slightly shifted to one side. But it couldn't be. Caleb was dead, the army had confirmed it, except he was wearing the uniform of the border guardians. The uniform of the very people who were threatening her home, the people who represented everything Caleb had stood against. Rose felt a dizzying wave of disbelief, shock, and a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Her heart hammered against her ribs, threatening to burst free. Her breath caught in her throat. She gripped the reins of her horse so tightly that her knuckles turned white. He turned slightly and Rose saw his face fully. It was Caleb, older, harder, but undeniably him. His eyes met hers for a fleeting moment and she saw a flash of something. Recognition, guilt, fear. Then, just as quickly, his expression hardened and he looked away, pretending he hadn't seen her. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Rose was frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Her dead husband was alive, and he was the enemy. Rose spurred her horse, leaving redemption behind in a cloud of dust. The ride back to the ranch was a blur. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. Could it have been a mistake, a cruel trick of the light, a doppelganger? Back at the ranch, she paced the floor of the main room, unable to sit still. Jebediah watched her with concern. "What's wrong, Rose? You look like you've seen a ghost." Rose hesitated. How could she explain what she'd witnessed without sounding insane? I think I saw Caleb," she finally whispered, the words catching in her throat. Jebediah frowned. "Caleb, but that's impossible." I know," Rose said quickly. "But it was him, Jebediah, I'm sure of it. Older, different, but it was him." She left out the part about the uniform for now. Jebediah shook his head, his face etched with sadness. "Rose, honey, you've been through so much. Grief can play tricks on the mind." "I'm not imagining things," Rose insisted. "I saw him, and I need to know if it was really him and why he's back." She couldn't just confront him outright. Not yet, she needed information. So she decided to subtly inquire around town to see if anyone else had seen a new face among the border guardians, someone who resembled Caleb. She'd ask casual questions, pretending she was just curious about the militia's growing numbers. The next day, she rode back to Redemption, steeling herself for what she might find. She visited the general store, chatting with the owner, Mrs. Henderson. "Those border guardians seem to be getting bolder," she remarked casually. "Are they recruiting new members?" Mrs. Henderson hesitated, glancing nervously around the store. "They've had a few new faces around," she admitted quietly. "A fellow with a scar on his chin and another one. Well, some folks say he looks a bit like your late husband, Caleb." Rose's heart skipped a beat. She forced herself to remain calm. "Oh, really? That's quite a coincidence." "Some coincidence," Mrs. Henderson muttered, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "Some folks are saying it's him come back from the dead, but I don't believe in ghosts." Rose thanked Mrs. Henderson and left the store, her mind reeling. It wasn't just her imagination. Others had seen him too. The impossible was real. But the question remained, why? That night Rose couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned. The image of Caleb in the border guardian's uniform burned into her mind. Was it really him? And if so, why? How could a man who stood for justice and fairness align himself with a group that represented the very opposite? Memories flooded her. Caleb teaching her how to shoot, his patience unwavering even when she missed the target by a mile. Caleb nursing a wounded bird back to health, his gentleness surprising for such a strong man. Caleb standing up to a group of bullies who were harassing a native family, his voice ringing with righteous anger. She remembered their wedding day, the joy in his eyes as he vowed to love and protect her. She remembered the dreams they had shared of building a life together on the ranch, of raising a family. How could that man, the man she knew and loved, become one of them? It made no sense. Unless something had happened to him during those 3 years. Something that had changed him, twisted him, turned him into someone she no longer recognized. The next morning, Rose decided to seek further confirmation. She needed to see him again to get a closer look, to be absolutely sure it was Caleb. She rode back to Redemption, this time with a specific plan. She knew the border guardians often gathered at the saloon in the evenings. She would go there pretending to be looking for information about a stolen horse and try to observe him without being noticed. As dusk settled over the town, Rose hitched her horse near the saloon and cautiously entered. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of whiskey. The room was filled with men, their faces illuminated by the flickering lamplight. She scanned the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest, and then she saw him. Caleb. He was sitting at a table with sailors and a few other militiamen talking in low tones. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see his face. The scar above his left eyebrow, the way he rubbed his chin when he was deep in thought, it was him, no doubt about it. A wave of nausea washed over her. It was really him. Her husband, the man she had mourned for 3 years, was alive, and he was one of them. The confirmation was like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and disoriented. The man she loved was gone, replaced by a stranger wearing a familiar face. Rose slipped out of the saloon unnoticed. The cool night air did little to calm her racing heart. Back at the ranch, she sat on the porch, staring out at the star-studded sky. The same sky they had shared countless nights under, whispering secrets and dreams. Now that sky felt vast and indifferent, a silent witness to her pain. She wrestled with her options. Confront him, demand answers, but what if he denied it? What if he was dangerous, expose him to the town, brand him a traitor? But what if there was a reason for his actions, a reason she couldn't understand? Kill him herself. The thought was horrifying, yet it flickered in her mind like a dark temptation. Sleep offered no escape. Nightmares plagued her. She saw Caleb falling in battle, his eyes pleading for help. She saw him standing beside Sila's, his face cold and devoid of emotion. She saw him pointing a gun at her, his expression filled with hatred. Each morning she awoke exhausted and tormented, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She couldn't eat, she couldn't focus on her work. The ranch, once a source of solace, now felt like a prison. Jebediah watched her decline with growing alarm. "Rose, you need to do something," he urged. "This is eating you alive." Rose knew he was right. She couldn't continue to live in this limbo, paralyzed by indecision. She had to choose a path, even if it was the wrong one, but which path? The rage was building, a slow burn that threatened to consume her. Rage at Caleb for betraying her, for betraying their vows, for betraying everything they had stood for. Rage at the border guardians for threatening her home and her way of life. Rage at herself for being so naive, for clinging to a hope that had now turned into a cruel mockery. But beneath the rage, a flicker of love still remained. A faint ember of the woman who had loved Caleb with all her heart. And that love made her decision all the more agonizing. How could she condemn a man she had once adored? How could she destroy the memory of their shared happiness? The line between grief and rage blurred, leaving her lost in a wilderness of conflicting emotions. She needed to decide, and soon, before the rising tensions and her own internal turmoil tore her apart. The border guardians were escalating their activities. They began confiscating supplies from local ranches, claiming it was for the greater good of protecting the settlers. Rose knew it was just a power grab, a way to control the region through fear and intimidation. One morning, Silas and a group of his men, including Caleb, rode up to the Halston ranch. "We're here to collect your contribution, Mrs. Halston," Silas said, his voice cold and devoid of warmth. Rose stood her ground, her eyes fixed on Caleb. He avoided her gaze, his face a mask of indifference. "I have nothing to contribute," she said, her voice firm. "I need everything I have to keep this ranch running." Silas sneered. "You're being uncooperative, Mrs. Halston. We can take what we need by force." "You'll have to," Rose replied, her hand instinctively moving towards the rifle leaning against the porch post. Silas's eyes narrowed. "Don't be foolish, woman. We don't want to hurt you." "Then leave," Rose said, her voice unwavering. Silas hesitated, his gaze shifting to Caleb. Caleb remained silent, his expression unreadable. Finally, Silas relented. "We'll be back, Mrs. Halston," he said, his voice laced with menace. "And next time we won't be so polite." They rode away, leaving Rose trembling with anger and fear. Caleb hadn't said a word, hadn't made a move to defend her. It was as if she were a stranger to him. That was it. That was the moment Rose knew she couldn't wait any longer. Caleb's silence, his complicity in Silas's threats had sealed his fate. He had chosen his side and it wasn't hers. The choice was made for her. It was no longer about grief or betrayal. It was about survival, about protecting her home, her land, her legacy. It was about stopping the border guardians, and that meant stopping Caleb. She looked at Jebediah, his face etched with worry. "It's time," she said, her voice filled with a grim determination. "It's time to end this." Rose knew what she had to do. She had to confront Caleb, and she had to be prepared to do whatever it took to protect what was hers. The line had been crossed, the game had changed, and Rose Halston was ready to play. Rose knew she couldn't just wait for the border guardians to return. She had to take the initiative. She saddled her horse and rode towards redemption. She wasn't sure where Caleb was, but she knew she had to find him. As she approached the town, she saw smoke rising in the distance. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. She spurred her horse, her heart pounding with a terrible premonition. When she reached redemption, she found chaos. The town was ablaze. The border guardians were looting and burning buildings, terrorizing the residents. Silas stood in the middle of the street, directing the mayhem with a cruel smile on his face. Rose saw Mrs. Henderson being dragged from her store, her face bruised and bleeding. She saw children crying, their parents desperately trying to protect them. The scene was a nightmare, a vision of hell on earth. And then she saw Caleb. He was standing near the saloon, watching the destruction with a detached expression. He wasn't participating, but he wasn't stopping it either. Rose dismounted her horse, her hand gripping the rifle. She pushed her way through the crowd, her eyes fixed on Caleb. "What are you doing?" she shouted, her voice filled with rage and disbelief. "How can you stand here and watch this happen?" Caleb turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I can't stop it, Rose," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You can try," Rose screamed. "You can fight back. This isn't you, Caleb. This isn't the man I married." "You don't understand," Caleb said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You don't know what I've been through." "Then tell me," Rose demanded. "Tell me why you're doing this. Tell me why you've become one of them." Caleb hesitated, his eyes darting around nervously. "It's not safe to talk here," he said. "Meet me tonight outside of town by the old oak tree and come alone." Rose hesitated. Could she trust him? Was this a trap? But she had no choice. She had to know the truth. "All right," she said, her voice barely audible. "Tonight by the old oak tree." She turned and helped Mrs. Henderson to safety, her heart filled with a mixture of anger and fear. The border guardian's actions had forced her hand. She had to confront Caleb, and she had to be prepared for anything. The fate of redemption and perhaps her own life hung in the balance. The old oak tree stood silhouetted against the moonlit sky, its branches gnarled and twisted like ancient arms reaching out for solace. Rose arrived on horseback, her rifle across her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. Caleb was already there, leaning against the tree, his face hidden in shadow. He straightened as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Why, Caleb?" Rose asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why are you doing this? How could you become one of them?" Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's a long story, Rose, a story you wouldn't believe." "Try me," Rose said, her voice hardening. "After everything I've seen, I think I can believe anything." Caleb hesitated, then began to speak, his voice low and strained. "After the skirmish, I wasn't dead. I was captured. They took me to a prison camp, a place where they tortured and brainwashed anyone who wouldn't agree with them." "The border guardians?" Rose asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "They weren't called that then," Caleb said, "but it was them. They wanted information about the army, about the settlers, about everything. I refused to give it to them. They beat me, starved me, broke my bones, but I still refused." "Then how?" Rose began, but Caleb cut her off. "They found a way," he said, his voice filled with pain. "They used drugs, hypnosis, I don't know what they did, but they changed me, Rose. They filled my head with lies, with hatred, with the belief that the settlers were the enemy." "And you believed them?" Rose asked, her voice incredulous. "I didn't want to," Caleb said, "but they were so powerful. They controlled my mind, my thoughts, my actions. I was a prisoner in my own body." "But you're free now," Rose said, her voice pleading. "You can leave them, you can come home." Caleb shook his head. "It's not that simple, Rose. They still have a hold on me. They can control me from afar. If I try to leave, they'll hurt me, or worse, they'll hurt you." "I don't believe you," Rose said, her voice filled with anger and disappointment. "You're just making excuses. You've become one of them and you like it." Caleb looked at her, his eyes filled with despair. "You don't understand," he said. "I'm trying to protect you, Rose. If you knew the truth, you'd be in danger." "The truth," Rose scoffed. "The truth is that you're a coward, Caleb. You're a traitor, and I don't know if I can ever forgive you." The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the rustling of the leaves in the wind. Rose stared at Caleb, her heart aching with a mixture of love and hate. She wanted to believe him, but she couldn't. He had changed too much. He was no longer the man she had married. "I'm sorry, Rose," Caleb said, his voice barely audible, "but this is the way it has to be." He reached inside his coat and Rose instinctively raised her rifle. The confrontation had reached its climax. The truth was out, but it was a truth she couldn't accept. The decision she had been dreading had arrived. It was time to choose. Rose squeezed the trigger, but Caleb didn't fall. Instead, he flinched, dropping the object he was pulling from his coat. It clattered on the ground, a worn, leather-bound book. Rose recognized it instantly. It was her mother's journal, a gift she had given to Caleb before he left for the border. "What?" Rose stammered, lowering her rifle. Caleb picked up the journal, his hands trembling. "They took it from our home after I disappeared," he explained, his voice choked with emotion. "It was the only thing I had left of you, of our life together. I always kept it with me. It reminded me of who I was, of what I was fighting for." Rose stared at the journal, her mind reeling. Could she have been wrong about him? Was there still a glimmer of the man she loved beneath the layers of brainwashing and manipulation? Before she could speak, a gunshot rang out, shattering the silence. Caleb gasped, clutching his chest. He stumbled backward, collapsing against the oak tree. Rose whirled around, her rifle raised. Silas emerged from the shadows, a smoking pistol in his hand. "Traitor," he spat, his eyes filled with hatred. "I knew I couldn't trust you." Rose fired, hitting Silas in the shoulder. He staggered but remained standing. More border guardians emerged from the trees, surrounding Rose and Silas. A fierce firefight erupted. Rose fought with a desperate fury, using the oak tree as cover. She took down several militiamen, but she was outnumbered. Caleb, despite his wound, managed to pull himself to his feet. He grabbed Silas's pistol and pointed it at him. "This ends now," he said, his voice filled with a newfound resolve. Silas laughed. "You can't do it, Caleb. You're one of us now." Caleb hesitated for a moment, then pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Silas in the head, killing him instantly. The remaining border guardians hesitated, their loyalty to Silas wavering. Caleb turned to them, his face filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "He was wrong," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "We're supposed to be protecting the settlers, not terrorizing them. Go home, leave this place, and never come back." The militiamen looked at each other, then slowly began to disperse, disappearing into the darkness. Rose lowered her rifle, her body trembling with exhaustion. She rushed to Caleb's side, kneeling beside him. "Why, Caleb?" she asked, her voice filled with tears. "Why did you do it?" Caleb smiled weakly, reaching out to touch her face. "For you, Rose," he whispered, "always for you." His hand fell limp and his eyes closed. Caleb was dead. Rose cradled his head in her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. He had redeemed himself, but at the ultimate cost. He had chosen her, and in doing so, he had sacrificed himself. The love they shared was more powerful than any brainwashing or manipulation, and in the end, it had set him free. The sun rose over redemption, casting long shadows across the burnt-out buildings. Rose stood amidst the ruins, the journal clutched tightly in her hand. The town was quiet, the remaining residents slowly emerging from their hiding places, their faces etched with shock and grief. Jebediah arrived on horseback, his face pale with worry. He rushed to Rose's side, embracing her tightly. "I heard the gunshots," he said, his voice trembling. "What happened?" Rose explained everything, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. She told him about Caleb's capture, his brainwashing, his struggle to break free. She told him about Silas's betrayal, the firefight, and Caleb's ultimate sacrifice. Jebediah listened in silence, his eyes filled with tears. When she finished, he simply nodded, offering her a comforting embrace. The people of Redemption began to rebuild their town, their spirits lifted by Caleb's sacrifice. They knew that he had been a flawed man, a victim of circumstance, but in the end he had chosen to do what was right. He had saved them from Silas and the border guardians. Rose stayed in redemption for a few days, helping with the cleanup and offering comfort to those who had lost loved ones. Then she returned to the Halston ranch. The ranch was quiet, the silence broken only by the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. Rose walked through the fields, her hand running over the tall grass. She thought about Caleb, about their life together, about the dreams they had shared. He was gone, but his memory would live on. He would be remembered as a hero, a man who had overcome adversity and sacrificed himself for the greater good. Rose knew that she would never forget him. She would always love him despite everything that had happened. Their love was a bond that could not be broken, even by death. She opened her mother's journal and began to read, her voice trembling with emotion. The words were familiar, but they took on a new meaning in light of recent events. They spoke of love, loss, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Rose closed the journal, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. The future was uncertain, but she knew that she would face it with courage and determination. She would honor Caleb's memory by living her life to the fullest, by fighting for justice and fairness, and by never giving up on her dreams. The sun set over the Halston ranch, painting the sky with vibrant colors. Rose stood on the porch, watching the darkness descend. She was alone, but she was not afraid. She knew that Caleb was watching over her, his spirit guiding her, his love protecting her. The end.